On November 13, 1820, American sailor Henry Palmer and his crew set foot on an uncharted island near the Antarctic Peninsula, a place that would later be named Deception Island. What followed over the next 2 days was so horrific, so unexplainable, that Palmer refused to speak of it for most of his life. It was only on his deathbed in 1877 that he revealed the gruesome events that had haunted him for decades. But what happened 137 years later was even worse. A team of Australian scientists arrived on the island in 1957, unaware of the nightmares buried beneath the ice and stone. Their expedition ended in disaster. The Australian government kept the details hidden for decades, fueling speculation that Deception Island should remain abandoned, untouched, forgotten. Yet, one scientist, Richard McCready, an American-born researcher, could no longer stay silent. His account shattered the secrecy, but by then, the island had already claimed more souls. This is Henry Palmer's story, transcribed into modern English. The moment I set foot on the shore, a deep unease settled into my bones. The air was unnaturally still, thick with the scent of brine and decay. I had sailed to many shores, some wild, some untouched, but never before had I felt watched the moment I arrived. The island was barren, its jagged cliffs rising like broken teeth against the gray sky. A distant fog rolled in, swallowing the farthest edges of the landscape. There was no sign of human life, no remnants of past visitors, only the occasional call of seabirds, carried by the wind like dying whispers. I suppressed my discomfort and ordered the men to set up camp just above the high tide mark. Night was approaching, and we had no knowledge of the land's dangers. Our plan was simple: wait until morning, then explore. Every morning, as a rule, we performed a head count. It was a necessary precaution. Men could wander, get lost, or worse. But the next morning, as I sipped my bitter, lukewarm coffee, a voice shouted from across the camp. "Norris and Clark are gone." I rushed to their tent. Empty. Their bedrolls were thrown aside, as if they had left in a hurry, or been dragged from their sleep. I immediately organized search parties, sending my men in groups of 3. I took 2 of my best sailors and set off along the beach, my hand resting on my pistol. The air had grown heavier, a chill creeping through my coat that had nothing to do with the Antarctic winds. As we walked, we spotted something in the sand. Footprints. Human. But not alone. Beneath the prints, where the sand was disturbed, something had been dragged. The deep grooves suggested a struggle, something had taken them. And then, we saw it. A cave. A dark wound in the rock outcropping ahead, gaping like the mouth of something starving. The tracks led directly inside. I stopped, raising a hand to signal my men. "Edward, be ready with your rifle. Something is off." "Aye, sir," he whispered, raising his weapon. I drew my pistol, thumb resting on the hammer, ready to fire. The silence inside the cave was unnatural, almost thick, as if the very air refused to move. The dim light barely touched the walls, revealing damp stone streaked with dark stains I prayed were natural. And then, I heard it. A gurgling noise. A rasping breath. I turned to my men, but their faces were blank with confusion. They hadn't heard it. Only I had. A sickness curled in my gut. I had been in war. I had seen death, caused death, but this fear was something else. A premonition, a sense of something truly wrong. We moved deeper. The cave twisted in unnatural ways, the darkness pressing in like it wanted to swallow us whole. The moment we lit our candles, a sound echoed through the passage. A moan. Not the wind. Not an animal. Something human. Something alive. I turned a corner and froze. There, on the cold, damp floor, lay the bodies of Norris and Clark. Or what was left of them. Their skin was gone. Not torn. Not shredded. Removed. Their muscles glistened raw in the candlelight, their bodies twisted as if they had been turned inside out. Blood pooled around them, seeping into the cracks of the stone. But then, one of them moved. A faint gasp escaped his lips as his trembling hand reached for me. His eyes, wet with terror, locked onto mine. He muttered something, barely audible. His voice cracked, weak, words lost in the rattling of his breath. In his palm, something gleamed. I held my candle closer. A stone. Small, smooth, a brilliant red, deeper than any blood I had ever seen. I turned to the other body. Another stone. Clutched in rigid, dead fingers. Then, his arm fell limp. The stone rolled from his grip, clattering onto the cave floor. Edward reached for it. "Don't touch it," I barked, and he jerked back, pressing himself against the stone wall. His voice trembled. "Sir, what did this to them?" I had no answer. No words to make sense of the horror before me. Only a single, undeniable truth settled in my chest. Nothing on this earth. A silence hung between us, the flickering light casting twisting shadows on the walls. Then, a sound. A low, guttural noise from deep within the cave. Something else was here. Watching. Waiting. And we needed to leave. Richard Macready's account. I was told never to speak of what happened on Deception Island in 1957. Threatened, even. But I don't care anymore. The men who died there were my friends, and they deserve to be remembered. Not as victims, but as the brilliant, curious scientists they were before the island took them. There were 5 of us stationed there. It was January, the height of the Antarctic summer, and the days were long and eerily bright. Our research station was nestled near an active volcano, which kept the air warm, sometimes unbearably so, reaching temperatures of 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat was unnatural, oppressive, and it made the island feel alive, as if it were breathing down our necks. The first week was routine. We settled into our work, mapping the terrain, collecting samples, and documenting the unique ecosystem. Ian and Ross, the geologists, were particularly excited. They spent their days exploring the volcanic slopes, returning with sediment samples and strange rocks they'd found. It wasn't until the 8th day that things began to unravel. I remember waking up late that night, my head foggy with sleep, and stumbling to the restroom. As I passed the room where Ian and Ross studied their samples, I noticed the light was still on. I paused, peering inside. They were standing close together, their backs to me, whispering in low, urgent tones. "You guys okay?" I mumbled, half asleep. They didn't respond. Didn't even turn around. Just kept whispering, their voices barely audible. I shrugged it off, assuming they were engrossed in their work. But as I walked away, a chill crept down my spine, one that had nothing to do with the cold. The next morning, I passed the room again on my way to the mess hall. Ian and Ross were still there, standing in the exact same spot. "Morning, guys," I said, trying to sound casual. "Have you been standing there all night or what?" They turned their heads slowly, their eyes hollow and distant, and nodded without a word. Then, just as slowly, they turned back to whatever they were staring at. I stood there for a moment, waiting for them to say something, anything. But they didn't. The silence was unnerving. In the mess hall, Peter and Max were already eating. I sat down with my tray and asked, "Did you guys talk to Ian and Ross this morning?" "They're acting odd." Max shook his head. "I saw them in the room, just standing there. Didn't say anything, though." "I saw them late last night, too," I said. "Same spot." When I tried talking to them, they just nodded. Didn't say a word. Peter chuckled, though it sounded forced. "Weird. Maybe they're just geeking out over some rocks. You know how geologists get." I nodded, but the explanation didn't sit right with me. There was something off about the way they looked at me, like they weren't really seeing me at all. After breakfast, I headed back to my room to get ready for the day. I was a marine biologist, and I planned to spend the morning scouring the beach for specimens. As I passed the rock room, I noticed Ian and Ross were gone. I checked their rooms, but they weren't there either. Protocol required everyone to notify the group before leaving the station. Ian and Ross knew that. They'd never just wander off without saying something. I told Peter and Max, but they dismissed it. "They probably just forgot," Max said. "You know how they get when they're excited about something." I wasn't convinced, but there wasn't much I could do. I grabbed my gear and headed out to the beach. The day was overcast, the sky a dull gray that seemed to press down on the island. As I worked, collecting samples and jotting notes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing there. But the beach was empty, the only sound the crunch of my boots on the volcanic sand. By the time I returned to the station, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. Peter and Max were waiting for me inside, their faces grim. "Ian and Ross still aren't back," Max said before I could even ask. My stomach dropped. They know the protocol. They wouldn't stay out this late. Peter crossed his arms, his expression uneasy. "It's going to be dark soon. I don't like the idea of going out there after sunset." "Neither do I said. "But it's going to be freezing tonight. If they're not dressed for it." We stood there in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on us. Finally, Max sighed. "Let's wait a little longer. If they're not back by morning, we'll head out at first light." I nodded, though every instinct screamed that we were already too late. What happened next was worse than any of us could have imagined. But that's a story for another time. First light came too slowly. Peter, Max, and I had agreed to search for Ian and Ross at dawn, but the night had been long and restless. My mind raced with dark thoughts, and sleep had been impossible. When Peter knocked on my door in the early hours, I was already awake, staring at the ceiling. "It's time," he said, his voice tight with worry. I didn't respond. I just got up, dressed in silence, and prepared to face the freezing Arctic air. The three of us spent the entire day combing the island, calling out for Ian and Ross, but there was no sign of them. No footprints, no discarded gear, nothing. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. By the time we returned to the station, exhaustion weighed heavily on us. Max immediately hopped on the radio and managed to reach someone on Livingston Island. "We'll send help," the voice crackled through the static. "But it'll take until tomorrow. We'll also notify headquarters in Australia." That night, after a quiet dinner, we retreated to our rooms. I fell asleep almost instantly, my body drained from the day's search. But my rest didn't last long. "Help me!" The shout jolted me awake. I sat up, disoriented, unsure if I dreamed it. Then it came again, louder this time. "Someone, please, God, help me." I grabbed the lantern I kept by my bed and rushed into the hallway. The voice was faint, but it sounded like it was coming from Max's room. As I approached, I heard something else, a wet, munching sound, like an animal devouring its prey. My stomach turned. I raised the lantern and stepped into Max's room. What I saw will haunt me until the day I die. Two figures stood over Max's bed, their bodies raw and glistening, stripped of skin. They were hunched over him, tearing into his flesh with their teeth. The sound of their chewing filled the room, mingling with Max's weak, gurgling cries. When they noticed me, they turned their heads slowly, their eyeless faces dripping with blood. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. "Peter!" I screamed, bursting into his room. "Get up! We need to leave. Something's happened to Max." Peter stirred groggily, his face pale in the lantern light. "What are you talking about? What's going on?" I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him out of bed, but he froze, his eyes widening in horror. I followed his gaze and saw them, the skinless men, standing in the doorway, their mouths smeared with blood. "What in the name of God?" Peter whispered. "Get up!" I shouted, but it was too late. They lunged at him, their claw-like hands grabbing hold of his arms and legs. Peter screamed as they bit into him, tearing chunks of flesh from his body. The sound was unbearable, a cacophony of agony and terror. I backed against the wall, my mind racing. The fire axe, it was in the hallway. I could use it to fight them off. But as I turned to run, one of the creatures looked at me, its head tilting unnaturally. Panic took over. I bolted down the hallway, my only thought to hide. The mess hall, the walk-in fridge. It was cold, but it was my only chance. I grabbed a down jacket from the rack as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Inside the mess hall, I yanked open the fridge door and threw myself inside. I tied a length of twine from the handle to a heavy shelf, hoping it would hold. The scratching started almost immediately. Something was trying to get in, clawing at the door with inhuman strength. The twine stretched taut, and I held my breath, praying it wouldn't snap. I turned off the lantern, plunging the fridge into darkness. I huddled in the corner, shivering, as the scratching continued. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. The cold seeped into my bones, and I drifted in and out of consciousness. Then I heard it. "Anybody here? Is there anybody here?" The voice was faint, but it was real. I stumbled to the door, pounding on it with numb hands. "I'm in here," I shouted, my voice hoarse. The door creaked open, and I squinted against the light. A man stood there, his face framed by a fur-lined hood. "Hello in there," he said in a thick Norwegian accent. "I'm Orjan, from the Norwegian research station on Livingston Island. We're the ones you talked to yesterday." I staggered out of the fridge, my legs trembling. Did you see them? The skinless men?" He frowned, confused. "No. We found 2 rooms with blood on the beds and some red stones, but no one else. Are you the only one left?" I nodded, my throat tight. As we walked through the station, I saw the blood-stained beds and the red stones scattered across the floor. The sight made my stomach churn. I didn't know what those stones were, but I was certain they had something to do with what had happened. The Australian government sent a special team to investigate, but after weeks of searching, they found nothing. No bodies, no answers. Years later, I was working in my yard when a man approached me. He said he was part of the team that had investigated the island. We ran into some issues, he said, his voice low. But I can't elaborate. I asked him if he knew anything that could bring me closure. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Stay away from that island." For more chilling tales of horror, please subscribe.